of 4 programmes about the record producer and impresario Walter Legge. It's presented by Humphrey Burton. Part 1, The Young Turk.
Well, I think he was truly a genius in terms of discovery. Walter Legge must surely rate as the greatest talent scout in the world of classical music, practically of all time.
He was the true impresario. That sort of person wouldn't survive today, but probably the industry is poorer for it. There are still nowadays people who you meet, their blood pressure will go through the roof if you mention Walter Legge. And they're not necessarily people who ever met him. He was such a strong personality. He did so many remarkable things, and yet he was one of these people who tended to rub people up the wrong way.
The man they're talking about produced this famous recording of Der Rosenkavalier back in the 1950s. Many people still hold it to be the best version ever made. He rarely put his name on an LP sleeve, yet this producer was revered throughout the industry. Revered and sometimes feared, too, for the whiplash of his tongue. Next June sees the centenary of his birth.
In January 1946, I went over to Central Europe to collect for my companies the best of the new generation of artists and the best of the old ones. And a couple of days before I arrived in Vienna, Karajan had given a sensational concert with the Vienna Philharmonic. I rang him up and suggested that we should lunch together. I'd never met him. We talked for about 3 hours, and then met almost every day from then on. My purpose was to try and get a contract out of him.
Walter Legge. He was ruthless, cool, shrewd, and utterly dedicated to the cause of fine music played by master musicians. At the end of World War II, Legge's biggest coup in a lifetime as an impresario was to sign up Herbert von Karajan and to provide him with a brand new world-class British orchestra upon which to polish his art, the Philharmonia of London. That Karajan was under a shadow because of his Nazi Party membership was of no matter to Legge, who went on to sign Callas, Oistrakh, de Sabata, Klemperer, Giulini, and many more of the biggest names in classical music. With them, he made records that have become benchmarks, sometimes legends, in the history of recorded classical music. And yet, in 1963, he resigned from EMI while seemingly at the height of his authority. And the following year, he attempted to disband the orchestra he himself had created. He died a dispirited, broken man, a prophet no longer honoured in his own country. Over the next 4 Sunday afternoons, we'll chart Legge's rise to power and influence, his colossal post-war achievement, and his abrupt departure from the musical mainstream. Walter Legge's father ran a tailoring business in Shepherd's Bush, West London. In his teens, Walter started going to the Royal Albert Hall's celebrity concerts on Sunday afternoons. He heard all his favourite artists in the flesh, either there or at the Queen's Hall, where in 1922, aged 14, he first encountered the baritone Tito Ruffo, then at the height of his career. The manliness, power, and dark resonance of Ruffo's voice, Legge wrote later, gave me a new and unimagined concept of sound. I became the most avid concert-goer, and soon found out how to slip in undetected to rehearsals, too. When he left school, Walter worked on the day for his father, cutting out gentlemen's suiting, but in the evenings he hung around London's musical corridors of power. He soon talked himself into a job with the new EMI company, an amalgamation of Parlophone, Columbia, and his master's voice. Aged only 20, he became what was called a lecturer, briefing sales staff about the new records, enthusing potential buyers at social gatherings, and so on. Fred Geisberg, HMV's chief producer since the days of Caruso, laid on a Wagner recital at the new Oxford Street showroom. The accompanist was Gerald Moore, who remembered becoming aware of a young man hardly out of his teens who had a lot to say. Tony Lecantro, who was a staff member of EMI for many years, has studied Walter Legge's burgeoning career in some detail, and it soon took a turn for the worse.
Unfortunately, because his views were already very strong, he was sacked from that job of lecturer at the HMV shop. He then comes back to the company, and in 1929 Legge was taken on to work in the English branch of HMV in what he describes as a newly formed literary department, and his job was to write sleeve notes and to edit a magazine called The Voice, and this was HMV's trade paper to the retail shops, and it describes how to set up window displays and gives biographies of all the current recording artists and so on, and that was Mr. Legge's job from 1929.
Walter Legge's PR job gave him the chance to interview artists and drop in on their recording sessions, which from 1931 onwards took place in the company's handsome new studios on the Abbey Road. He'd certainly been hovering in Fred Geisberg's entourage when Sir Edward Elgar, then 75, came to conduct his violin concerto with the 16-year-old Yehudi Menuhin as an incomparable soloist. Legge inherited his love of records from his father, who'd amassed a fine collection. Walter's ambition was to become a record producer, like Fred Geisberg, and his breakthrough was a direct result of a scheme he devised to record songs by his favorite composer, Hugo Wolf. In the panicky commercial atmosphere of the early 30s, when the recording industry was still recovering from the Wall Street crash, the hard-nosed businessmen who ran the company were opposed to any highbrow project, so Legge proposed the creation of a Hugo Wolf Society. The idea was perfectly simple. When enough subscribers had paid up in front, the company would record for them an album dedicated to Hugo Wolf's songs. It was an audacious thing for Legge to have done, as Tony Lecantro explains.
You have to realise, of course, that the International Artist Department, of which Fred Geisberg was a member, this was the Holy of Holies. This was the inner sanctum of the parent company. This was a very grand and glorious organisation. This was the outfit that made all the great international recordings with the greatest international classical artists. And Legge was just simply a junior employee of the English branch.
For this first album, the singer was to be Eleanor Gerhardt, then in her early 40s, and one of the supreme leader singers of her day. The choice of songs was to be Legge's, and since he knew the repertoire better than anybody else, he sat in on the recordings, and he was eventually allowed to take over from Fred Geisberg, and thus achieved his ambition to be a producer by the ripe old age of 25. It was a meteoric rise. Ernest Newman, the author of a biography of Wolf, mentioned the new scheme in his weekly Sunday Times column, and the required quota of 500 subscribers was soon reached. In April 1932, the first Hugo Wolf album was issued. One of its jewels was In dem Schatten meiner Locken. A boy has fallen asleep, his head entangled with his sweetheart's curly tresses. Should she wake him up? No, no. 9-9. That was Eleanor Gerhardt with Konrad van Boos at the piano. 5 more Hugo Wolf Society song albums were to follow, each with full texts and translations and an essay by Ernest Newman. Walter Legge recruited most of the great leader singers of the day, sometimes recording them in Berlin, more often in London. Herbert Janssen was the best light baritone of the 1930s. Count John McCormack was a renowned suave-voiced tenor. A younger singer from Germany, Gerhard Husch, was equally admired on the opera stage and the recital platform. Here he is in Hoffärtig seid ihr, one of the discs in the second Wolf album. You're so vain, so lovely but so arrogant, but you're no wealthy daughter of Alexander. If you're not interested in love, then let contempt be your lot.
Fertig seid ihr schönes Kind und geht mit euren Dreierlohn auf stolzem Fuß. Spricht man euch an, kaum dass ihr Rede steht, als kostet euch zu viel ein holder Gruß. Ist keines Alexanders Töchterlein, kein Königreich wird seinem Mitgift sein. Und willst du nicht das Gold und ihm das Dünn, willst du nicht Liebe, nimm Verachtung hin.
The music historian Richard Osborne has no doubts about the significance of Legge's Hugo Wolf Society.
It was an extraordinarily specialist thing to do, but I suppose there was an almost Reithian element to the project. You know Reith's famous remark, I know what the British people want and they're damn well not going to get it. And Legge must have persuaded Geisberg and his superiors at EMI that Wolf was very much a specialist taste, but he was a great, great songwriter. We will sell them to specialists. We will probably sell no more than 300 or 400 copies initially, but it's worth doing. And history proves that that is one of the great recordings of its period.
In 1932, Legge branched out as an impresario, founding the London Leader Club, whose weekly Sunday evening concerts were held in the ballroom of the Dorchester Hotel. He created the kind of affluent connoisseur atmosphere which was soon to be associated with Glyndebourne. The audience was dressed up to the nines, and 10 ambassadors were on the subscription list. Ria Ginster in Ich hab ihn Penner, the pianist Michael Raucheisen. From the start, Legge made it clear that at his recording sessions he'd concentrate on the interpretations, unlike his predecessor. Peter Martland has written a history of EMI.
Fred Geisberg had to be both a technician and a record producer. Walter Legge can be a record producer and leave the technical side to the skilled engineers.
Riding high, Walter Legge dreamt up another subscription project for HMV. Arthur Schnabel was booked to record the complete piano sonatas of Beethoven. Like the Wolf Society, this was to prove a 7-year project. Volume 1 appeared in June 1932. Beethoven Society was phenomenally successful. After 3 years and 3 volumes, the company had sold £80,000 worth of records worldwide. That's well over £1 million in today's money. Other HMV societies offered Edwin Fischer playing Bach's 48 on the piano, and Wanda Landowska in harpsichord works by Bach, Couperin and Scarlatti. Pablo Casals recorded the solo cello suites of Bach. The Pro Arte did all the mature quartets of Haydn. Fritz Kreisler played the 10 violin sonatas of Beethoven. Legge's vision rewarded the company handsomely and put him firmly on London's musical map, as Tony Lecantro confirms.
So the whole of the 1930s, as far as the newly formed EMI was concerned, really depended pretty strongly on those subscription issues, because that's how the company knew that from year to year the recordings it was making would be sold, because the customers had already paid in advance, and that was Mr. Legge's brilliant idea.
Legge seems to have had a marvellously relaxed relationship with his employers. They were happy for him to promote concerts, and in 1933 he launched a third career as a music critic, second string to Neville Cardus at the prestigious Manchester Guardian. This new evening job posed a potential clash of interests, since he could be very hard, particularly on singers, but he did it all with a style and wit that reminds Richard Osborne of Sir Thomas Beecham.
Reading Legge's reviews, reading 1,000 memoranda in the EMI archives, every one of which is economical, beautifully phrased, often very funny. They're probably funnier to read in the archive than if you were receiving the letter. This, I think, came to some extent from Beecham. He didn't imitate Beecham, but he was a marvellously elegant writer. And if you read the reviews that he wrote in the Manchester Guardian in the 1930s, you also get a fine insight into the way that his mind worked and the way that he judged and thought of artists. And those artists who he respected and why he respected them, you can see Legge the producer in the making, as it were.
And anyway, a full-time writing career wasn't his ambition. Legge wanted to be in the thick of the musical action, and no friendship was more important to his development than that with Sir Thomas Beecham. They first met in 1934 and recognized each other as kindred spirits, connoisseurs, fellow movers and shakers, despite the 27-year difference in their ages. Indeed, Beecham became another father figure, like Ernest Newman. Beecham was a Columbia artist by contract, but he insisted on having HMV's Legge for all his recordings, and with Beecham at the helm, Legge recorded several Sibelius symphonies, and in 1935 the Sibelius Violin Concerto, played by its finest pre-war exponent, Jascha Heifetz. technique, the dignity and the command of Heifetz's performance, wrote Legge, have to be heard to be believed. Paganini at his best cannot have played harmonics at speed with the sureness and beauty of tone that Heifetz displayed tonight. Walter Legge is reviewing a Heifetz performance in the Manchester Guardian, a year after Heifetz had recorded the Sibelius Concerto at Abbey Road, but the review can't have done the record sales any harm. Heifetz, Legge continued, is the first violinist we have heard who can approach the work with the sublime confidence that he is master of all its difficulties. It holds no terrors for him. His bow arm and left hand are seemingly infallible. Walter Legge's collaboration with Thomas Beecham reached its zenith when they embarked upon a daring project to record a complete Mozart opera under studio conditions. HMV had already negotiated a special deal with the new festival opera at Glyndebourne. At the end of each of its first 3 seasons, Fred Geisberg had moved in with his equipment to record the 3 Da Ponte operas. They are renowned ensemble interpretations enjoyed to this day. But although he praised these performances in his newspaper reviews, Legge was determined to go one stage further and mount his own production, especially for the gramophone, with Beecham at the helm and a cast which he himself would prepare with meticulous care. Not in London or Glyndebourne, but in Berlin. HMV's next Mozart Opera Society issue would be nothing less than Die Zauberflöte.
Der Vogelfänger bin ich, ja steht lustig, heißer Hopp, ha, ha. Ich Vogelfänger bin bekannt, bei alt und jung im ganzen Land. Weiß mit dem Locken umzugehen und mich auf Pfeifen zu verstehen. Drum kann ich so lustig sein, denn alle Vögel sind ja mein.
Legge's old friend Gerhard Husch from the Hugo Wolf Society sang Papageno. The great Tiana Lemnitz was Pamina. With astonishing flair, Legge arranged every aspect of the casting, the piano rehearsals, and a week of recording at Berlin's Elektrola studio in November 1936, with just a couple of pick-up days during the winter. It was all done within a tight budget of £3,000, and the result was universally praised.
Mich zu fühlen ist dann für Weiber erster Blick.
Beecham was so impressed with Legge's abilities, this young man who just seemed to understand everything about classical music and recording and so on, that Beecham invited Legge to come and help him run his Covent Garden opera seasons. And apparently, according to Legge, Beecham said to him, I'll choose the operas that we'll do, and you choose the artists and the conductors.
So Legge became assistant artistic director of the upcoming international opera season at Covent Garden. He had to give up the reviewing job for the Manchester Guardian, but he somehow persuaded HMV that he could go on working as a record producer under Geisberg, and he continued to attend performances all over Europe on the hunt for the best artists. Walter Legge seemed destined for the highest branches of the musical tree. Fred Geisberg retired in May 1939, and whatever the internal rivalries at EMI, Legge would eventually have succeeded him as the artistic director of what was then described as the greatest record company in the world. Or, with his flair for organisation and for tapping into high society, Legge could have developed the opera season at Covent Garden, raising enough funds to turn it into something much closer to a permanent company, such as the ones he so much admired in Vienna and Berlin. Nobody since Diaghilev had wielded his authority in the musical world. As we shall hear in next week's programme, the war changed all that, and so did the peace which ensued. Legge was to be locked out of Covent Garden and dropped by Sir Thomas Beecham. But this young Turk had already come a very long way from his modest beginnings as a tailor's son from Shepherd's Bush. The war blocked his path, but when it ended, he was ready for great things, and the new technology of long-playing records would open up a brave new world for him to conquer.
And you can hear part 2 at the same time next week, 3:30, here on Radio 3. These programmes about Walter Legge are presented by Humphrey Burton and produced by Clive Portbury.
And impresario Walter Legge. It's presented by Humphrey Burton. Part 2, Our Man in Vienna.
By the start of the Second World War, Walter Legge had produced operas at Covent Garden, been a critic for the Manchester Guardian, and produced many recordings with major artists for a major record company, EMI. He was too short-sighted to fight in the war, and when his colleagues and rivals were called up, he stayed behind to mind the shop at Abbey Road. The flow of recording work slowed to a trickle, however, and what music there was had to be patriotic. Gerald Moore was the house accompanist for this sentimental ballad, which Legge produced when the phony war was just beginning, and Britain's favourite tenor was doing his bit.
Dear little children, when you kneel down to say your evening prayer, ask God to bless all our brave men and have them in his care. Ask him to help them in the fight and comfort those in pain. Then whisper ere you close your eyes, please bring them home again.
The unmistakable voice of Count John McCormack, then in his mid-50s, and a good friend of Walter Legge's ever since he'd recorded Hugo Wolf's songs for him in happier times. With a decade of experience as an impresario behind him, Legge soon found other war work to keep him busy. Tony Nicantro, who worked at EMI for many years.
The next thing we know is that Mr. Legge is running Ensa, the organisation that provided culture and entertainment for the troops. And there's Walter Legge running EMI's classical recording program, such as it was, and running Ensa. So again, doing two people's work, obviously. You can imagine he was a very busy man during the war years.
He built up quite a legend for himself. He would come into the office with a cigarette drooping from his mouth, waving a walking stick, a creature of uncertain temper, it was said, with a supreme indifference to the feelings of others. Among the singers Legge dispatched on wartime tours was a dashing young mezzo named Nancy Evans. In 1940, Legge recorded her in this curiosity, a setting of Shakespeare by Adrian Beecham, son of the conductor, and Sir Thomas himself is at the piano.
Where are you roaming? Oh, stay and hear your true love's coming, that can sing both high and low.
The voice of Nancy Evans. Walter Legge married her the next year. During the war, Legge developed another private passion. From gifted string players in uniform, he formed a quartet, which he named the Philharmonia, after the familiar yellow pocket scores published by Universal Edition. In the quartet, which was launched in 1942, was buried the seed of a grander vision, a world-class orchestra drawn from the country's finest players. Legge kept his tabs on all the promising youngsters in the business, many of them members of the RAF orchestra based in Uxbridge, whose first horn was the young virtuoso Dennis Brain. In fact, within 2 months of the war ending, Legge was able to launch the Philharmonia Orchestra. But victory was several years away, and meanwhile he was always on the lookout for new talent. After the Normandy invasion, he organized Ensa groups to perform on mainland Europe, and he took advantage of his official position to work on behalf of his company EMI as well. Arriving in Paris soon after the liberation, he discovered the young violinist Jeanette Neveu, and was immediately struck by her extraordinary vitality and superhuman energy, as he wrote. He was deeply moved by her astonishing identification with the Sibelius Concerto, which she recorded the following year in London in a single day. She smoked incessantly during the sessions and practiced for every moment until her chin rest drew blood from her neck. Jeanette Neveu, who died tragically young, killed in a plane crash, an incredible transfer from the original 78 recording, which was one of the first to feature Legge's new Philharmonia Orchestra. A few weeks later, in December 1945, the Royal Opera House began its first post-war season. Greatly to Legge's fury, a businessman had been appointed general manager, and Legge was also passed over for the post of artistic director, a job for which he felt himself, with some justification, to be better qualified than anybody else in the world. He'd have taken his own orchestra, the Philharmonia, into the Covent Garden pit and created an organization similar to Vienna's, but it was not to be. He was told to his face that he was too intransigent. Meanwhile, while one potential career was slipping away from him, Legge returned to Europe to sign a contract with another remarkable virtuoso, a former pupil of Alfred Cortot, about whom all Paris had been buzzing, the Romanian-born pianist Dinu Lupati. The composer Francis Poulenc described Dinu Lupati as an artist of divine spirituality. Legge fell in love with his exquisite playing and brought him over to London 4 times to make records. What proved to be the final sessions took place in Geneva only months before his death from leukemia, aged only 33. Lupati was like Legge, an infallible perfectionist. He made take after take in search of the idea chording. Walter Legge may have been treasured as a friend by most of the artists he worked with after the war, but in company terms he was still something of an outsider. Here's EMI's Tony Lecantro.
I have the impression that Legge was very, very hard to control. He did all his own things off his own bat. He rarely attended meetings, he rarely put things on paper. He would go off and find artists and then come back to the International Artist Department and say, get a contract ready for Hans Richter Hauser, and these are the terms that I've negotiated. You know, he really did not work as a member of a team. He never did.
The most important of Legge's European destinations after the war was Vienna, where most of the best singers had gathered in the aftermath of Germany's total destruction. The pianist Graham Johnson knew Legge well in later years and heard from him firsthand about
huge trips that he made, almost Harry Lime-like, Orson Welles-like, into the middle of a partitioned Vienna. That was a huge moment for him, and very, very important, because he enjoyed going on the road and making inquiries and using a mixture of huge charm and straightforward effrontery simply to get his way and to make certain that he had the best artists in hand, as it were, for EMI.
It was a tremendous coup that Walter Legge got into Vienna ahead of all his rivals. He did it by working through a small Swiss company which EMI had bought to look after its interests in Central Europe. In a Zurich bar, Walter bumped into an American officer who gave him an overnight train ticket. He was on his way to sign up Herbert von Karajan.
In January 1946, I went over to Central Europe to collect for my companies the best of the new generation of artists and the best of the old ones. And a couple of days before I arrived in Vienna, Karajan had given a sensational concert with the Vienna Philharmonic. I rang him up and suggested that we should lunch together. I'd never met him. He was living on the 7th or 8th floor of a block of flats, sharing a room with somebody he didn't know. No light. We talked for about 3 hours, and then met almost every day from then on. My purpose was to try and get a contract out of him.
The contract was generous for a completely unknown artist such as Karajan, a 5% royalty and a minimum of 12 double-sided 78s a year, plus 5,000 Swiss francs in advance. But Legge knew he'd struck gold, on a personal level as well as artistic.
When it came to the signing of the contract, we signed 2 copies, and I gave one to Karajan and said, keep that. He said, no, I know you now, I don't need to read it. We know each other.
Karajan was Austrian by birth, but his career up to that point had been in Germany. He'd arrived in Vienna just before Legge and had already conducted 2 concerts when the Russians banned further public appearance because he'd not been cleared by the denazification court. But the talk in musical Vienna was of nothing but Karajan's mastery with the Philharmonic. His performance of Strauss's Don Juan, wrote the orchestra's chairman, was a wonderful firework display of virtuosity and rhythmic élan.
They got on immediately.
The Karajan biographer, Richard Osborne.
The Karajan was, I think, intrigued. I mean, here was a man who spoke fluent German, was an executive of the world's leading record company, and who knew at first hand all the heroes Karajan himself had had in Austria in the 1920s and 30s. Legge was a little bit like English gentlemen on the Grand Tour in the 17th, 18th centuries, or the great Victorian explorers arriving in the middle of Africa. Somebody who arrived in your midst, spoke the language, knew more about your culture than you probably did, and simply took you over by force of personality. I think that's the impression that Legge must have given Karajan on that famous day in January in Vienna in 1946. He had a passion for quality and for purveyors of quality, and he knew instinctively that this young 37-year-old conductor was the future.
Legge saw a loophole in the Russians' ban on Karajan. There was nothing to stop recording sessions. So in September 1946 he was back, and Karajan's EMI career was launched in the Musikverein's Golden Hall. Working conditions were appalling. The Viennese electrical supply was haywire, Legge reported. To get sufficient and stable current to operate the machines and heat the waxes, I had to hire a petrol-driven, dynamo-like contraption. And that was a lesser difficulty. The problem was how to get the petrol to make the thing work. And so each evening, my secretary and I did the rounds of the taxi stands, bartering with cabbies for their petrol, which often had to be siphoned from the vehicle's tanks. But the music flowed. Beethoven, Mozart, Tchaikovsky, Johann Strauss. the polka Leichtes Blut, the Vienna Philharmonic, conducted by Herbert von Karajan. And Karajan it was who wrought the greatest change in Walter Legge's entire life, by introducing him to the German soprano who'd eventually become his second wife. Richard Osborne explains.
Karajan was with him at a concert in Vienna, and he said, "You see that girl sitting down there? She is the greatest young soprano in Europe." So Legge said, "Well, I'll sign her." Approached Schwarzkopf, and she didn't like being offered a contract without an audition. So Legge auditioned her, and she came along with the Wolf song Wer rief dich denn, which lasts about a minute and a half. Karajan was there. They started rehearsing, and they got to the final phrase of the song. And I think Legge spent an hour and a quarter, going through every possible shape to the phrasing, the timing, the colour, the weight. Karajan eventually said, "I'm not taking any more of this. I mean, this is pure sadism," and left. Schwarzkopf actually rather liked it, because, I mean, here was a perfectionist. Here was somebody who absolutely knew what he wanted and would drive her to the point where she could realise that.
Wer rief dich denn? Wer hat dich hingestellt? Wer hieß dich kommen, wenn es dir zur Last? Geh zu dem Leben, das dir mehr gefällt. Geh dahin, wo du die Gedanken hast. Geh nur, wohin dein Sinn entsteht, und denke, dass du zu mir kommst, will ich gern dir schenken. Geh zu dem Leben, das dir mehr gefällt. Wer rief dich denn? Wer hat dich höher bestellt?
Elisabeth Schwarzkopf, with Gerald Moore at the piano. Legge had fallen in love with Schwarzkopf. His earlier marriage had failed, but this certainly didn't deter him from signing up other new stars in the operatic firmament, notably Hans Hotter, Irmgard Seyfried. He also recorded the remarkable Austrian soprano Maria Cebotari, whom he'd heard in London before the war. Ariadne auf Naxos, Karajan conducting. They were still recording on 78 waxes, remember, in 4-minute takes, but what a thrilling world of music drama was beckoning these two men, Legge and Karajan, on the threshold of long-playing records. In the spring of that year, 1948, Karajan had made his debut in London with the Philharmonia Orchestra. A dream come true for Legge. His own orchestra, after 3 years, already the equal of Vienna or Berlin, and his conductor, the man he had discovered and nurtured.
The morning of the concert, he had his last rehearsal. It lasted probably not more than 8 minutes. He said, "Gentlemen, I want to know how much fortissimo I can expect tonight. Give me the last 2 chords of Beethoven 5 with all the force of which you're capable, but still to retain a beautiful and an absolutely beautiful sound, but the maximum of force." The stick came down like a whiplash, and he did that about 20 times until he really had the maximum that he knew he could expect. Because until then, he'd not let them play fortissimo. All the rehearsal had been, keep the dynamics down, we'll wait for the occasion. And then, now I want to know what you have. Now show me.
Herbert von Karajan was the crown prince of European conductors, but the old king was still Wilhelm Furtwängler. Legge had bumped into him by chance on his first visit to Vienna, and was soon recording with him too, but relations weren't congenial. Richard Osborne again.
The Furtwängler situation, as far as Legge was concerned, was simply a question of how to deal with him, what repertory to give him. Furtwängler was difficult. I mean, he didn't like recording. Legge knew that the era of tape recording and longer takes was still a little way off. He was amazingly jealous of all his colleagues. If anybody was doing anything, he wanted to do it, which of course makes it very, very difficult to run repertory policy. So Furtwängler was somebody to be wooed where possible and to be coped with. You get these wonderfully soothing letters that Legge writes to Furtwängler after Furtwängler sent him an absolute stinker. And one of them he writes back when Furtwängler's complaining about the attention being given to other conductors, another conductor in particular, the dreaded Karajan, and Legge writes back and says to Furtwängler, "The sun is no less brilliant when the moon is visible by day."
During a recording session, Legge whispered an instruction to the timpani player as he passed him on the way back to the control room. Furtwängler was furious. "Mr. Legge, if you have anything to tell to any member of the orchestra, you will tell it to me." The highest point of their uneasy collaboration came in 1952, a London-based recording using the Philharmonia Orchestra of Tristan and Isolde. Furious row erupted during one of the sessions. Furtwängler stormed out and tried to ban Legge from the production. Walter Legge fought back overnight in a powerful memo to the EMI management. "In that field of musical activity where I have a completely free hand," he wrote, "I have, in spite of knowing that Furtwängler has been intriguing against me, consistently engaged him for concerts. That he fears my critical judgment of him as a performer is understandable. My greatest moral asset is that neither love, friendship, money, ambition, enmity, nor hate can influence my artistic judgments." Furtwängler was overruled. Legge was reinstated. Tristan and Isolde proved a great success. And with it, to quote the critic of the Times, recording of opera achieved maturity.
Humphrey Burton with the second of his 4 programmes about Walter Legge. The producer was Clive Portbury. And you can hear part 3 at the same time next week, 3:30. Now here are Donald MacLeod and Rob Cowan in duet.